Hello and welcome to the Shepheard Walwyn podcast series. My name is Jonathan Brown. Shepheard Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England. Our purpose is to uncover and promote new ideas to society's oldest problems. And whilst our specialty is ethical economics, something Anthony Werner, our driving force for over 40 years, has pioneered, we have branched out over the years to other related areas such as the environment and the lives and works of society's change agents. These podcasts promote ideas we're convinced can actually help us build a better society for all of us. So have a listen and be sure to share with your friends if you like them, but also tell us what you think. These are debates we all need to be part of. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Today we have a re-released interview from spring 2022 with one of our most illustrious authors, Michael Hudson, perhaps the world's most influential but rarely acknowledged economist. Michael has had a remarkable career working first as a practical or reality-based economist for the likes of David Rockefeller at Chase Manhattan Bank, Herman Kahn at the Hudson Institute, and following the release of his most famous work, Super Imperialism, the Economic Strategy of American Empire, he advised the US State Department on how they could continue to fund the Vietnam War and other military campaigns when the gold was running out. And this led to the global dollarization strategy that has shaped the world for the last 50 years. More recently, he has advised the Chinese government on how to de-dollarize their economy and avoid the traps that the US finance economy is now falling into. Michael has written extensively on ancient economies in the Near East, and many of his more recent ideas were first included in the Shepheard Walwyn work, A Philosophy for a Fair Society, written with Chris Feeder, the late G.J. Miller, and Fred Harrison. So do check out this book if you'd like an introduction to his whole body of work. In this episode we look at how economics got corrupted from industrial economics, where people made money by making things, to a finance, insurance and real estate or FIRE economy, where a small elite group make money by manipulating financial instruments. We then look at his views on how the economic forces continue to shape global politics, and whilst this interview took place in spring 2022, just as the Ukraine-Russia war was getting started, it's worth listening to as his insights were startlingly accurate. And this talk is a great primer for the new podcast, which will be out soon. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Well, it's good to be here.
So Michael, I think you have one of the most extraordinary upbringings and journeys into economics. I just wondered if you can give our listeners some sense of how you got from being the godson of Leon Trotsky all the way to what I consider to be probably the most important economist in the world today.
There's no direct causality there that could have been anticipated. I never studied economics in college because I went to school at the University of Chicago, where we knew that there were some students at the university who were at the business school, and they were such strange people that we never even thought of going near them. There was something otherworldly about them, something abstract. So my degree was in German history and history of culture, because the head of the history of culture department was Jürgen Jallis. He was a German professor. At the time, my intention was to become a musician, and I had to learn German to read the works of Heinrich Schenker in music theory. My teachers were German. In the history of culture, most of the books that I was reading were in German, and the German professors were also head of the comparative literature department and other departments, and it meant that I could take all the courses cafeteria style at the university that I wanted. So then I had to go to work when I graduated, went to work for a while as a public relations person for Technical Society, a publisher near a block away from the university, and then went to work for Free Press, that was headed by Jerry Kaplan, who was a Trotskyist, a follower of Max Shachtman. And he wanted to send me to New York to help set up Free Press there. Right after I came to New York, Trotsky's widow died, and Max Shachtman was the executor of her estate, thought I should go into publishing by myself. And I'd already had the copyrights for George Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist. I tried to get funding for a publishing company with Trotsky's works and other works. I'd been writing a history of music and art theory. And needless to say, I didn't get any funding because nobody was at all interested in publishing the works of Trotsky. I even tried to get Dwight Eisenhower to write the introduction to his military papers. Wouldn't work. I happened to meet the father of a girlfriend of one of my schoolmates, Gavin McFadgen, and his name was Terence McCarthy. And he was the first American translator of the first history of economic thought that was written. And that was Karl Marx's Theories of Surplus Value, where he reviews the whole of classical economics. He said he would help guide me in economic thinking. I'd get a PhD in economics, go to work on Wall Street to see how the world worked. But I had to read all of the bibliography in Marx's Theory of Surplus Value. So I had to begin buying the books and ended up working with one of the reprinters, Gus Kelly, who was reprinting many of the classical economists. He was a socialist publisher. And there were other dealers in America, Samuel M. Barris, Sidney Millman, and I began buying all of the 19th century classical economic books that I could, since that was the only way that I could get copies. And there was very little appearance in classical economics in school. I had to take classes in the evening. I began by working at a bank for 3 years, the Savings Banks Trust Company, which was the central bank, a commercial bank acting as a central bank for the savings banks that in America finance mortgages. All the savings are reinvested in mortgages. So for 3 years, my job was to track the real estate the mortgage market, interest rates, the funding of mortgages, the growth of assets by the savings banks, and that was compound interest. All of the growth in savings in the New York savings banks in the early 1960s were the crediting of dividends. So you'd have a step function like that, all going up exponentially. There was hardly any new saving. It's as if you just left a given amount of savings in 1945 and let the amount of savings rise exponentially. And then all of this increase in savings was recycled into the real estate market. The New York banks wanted to extend their market, so they couldn't just keep bidding up New York prices. So they won the right to lend out of state. They wanted to lend to Florida, especially. And my job was basically seeing that real estate prices were whatever a bank would lend. And at that time in America, banks would not lend you a mortgage if the debt service exceeded 25% of your income. And you had to put down usually 30% of the down payment, but possibly 10%. So housing was affordable. You could buy a really nice house for $20,000 or $30,000. Now it costs $200,000 to buy just a one-room apartment in a condominium. But I bought a house for $1 down. Ostensibly, it was $45,000. I took out a mortgage from Chase for half the price, and the other half was a purchase money mortgage. It was easy. Anybody could get a house in New York at that time, and housing was still affordable. After I finished my PhD courses, I changed jobs, and my real interest at the time was international finance, the balance of payments. So I went to work at Chase Manhattan as a balance of payments economist. This is at a time when balance of payments economics and really balance sheet analysis was not taught in schools. It was very specialized. And I realized when I went through the training that what I learned, especially in monetary theory, had nothing to do at all with what I was learning in practice. For instance, in the monetary theory, that was the era of Milton Friedman in the 60s and 70s with money theory. And he thought that when you create more money, it increases consumer prices. I thought that obviously was not how things worked at all. When banks create money, they don't lend for people to spend. There are a few personal loans for spending, but almost always 80% of bank loans in America, as in England, are mortgage loans. They lend against property already in place. They also lend for corporate mergers and acquisitions. And by the 1980s, this meant corporate takeovers. They lend to increase asset prices, not consumer prices. And just to show you before we go on, the problem is that you could say that money creation actually lowers consumer prices, because of all the bank credit creation, most of it, 80%, is to increase housing prices. Then banks, in order to increase their loan market, will lend more and more money against every piece of real estate, whether it's residential real estate or commercial property ownership. And pretty soon, as you know, that by 2008, you could buy property with no money down at all. and take 100% mortgage, sometimes even 102 or 103%, so you'd have enough money to pay the closing fees. And the government then said, instead of limiting the amount of money that a bank could lend against income, the proportion of income devoted to mortgage service that was federally guaranteed increased to 43%. That's a lot more than 25%. That's 18% of personal income more in 2008 than in the 1960s had to go simply to pay mortgage interest in order to get a house. So I realized that this was deflationary. The more money you had to spend on mortgage interest to buy a house as land and real estate was financialized, the less you had to spend on goods and services. And this was one of the big problems that was slowing the economy down. Well, it was obvious to me that the rent was being turned into interest. And that was the phrase that was used. Rent is for paying interest. If I talked with various developers about buying buildings, they said, well, we don't try to buy our buildings without any money at all. The banks will lend us the money to buy a building, and they calculate how much is your rental income going to be. That rental income will carry how much of a bank loan at a given percentage, and we calculate how much of a given bank loan this rental income will do, and we'll lend you the money in it. So basically, the rent was financialized, and the role that was played in the 19th century by landlords is now played by banks. In the 19th century, the problem was absentee landlords, who were the heirs of the warlords who conquered England or other European countries in the Middle Ages. You had a hereditary rent. Well, now rent has been democratized. But it's been democratized on credit, because obviously the only way that if you're a wage earner or an investor that you can afford to buy a whole building is on credit, and has transformed real estate into a financial vehicle. So that's what rent is for paying interest means. So I found that there's a symbiotic sector. Finance, insurance, and real estate. The FIRE sector is basically the central driver of the economy, and it's basically a financialized economy, very active lobbyists. Most real estate tax policy in America is made at the local level these days, because the financial sector, after the income tax was introduced and after World War I, basically has made commercial real estate tax exempt by the pretense that buildings depreciate in value instead of rise in price. The pretense that they wear out, even though normal landlords pay about 10% of the rent income for repairs and upgrades to keep the building from wearing out. Today in New York, and I'm sure in London too, the older a building is, the better it's built, as the real estate interests, the developers have dumbed down and basically crapified building codes, so that the newer the building, the worse it's and more shoddily it's built. They call shoddy buildings luxury real estate, meaning it's built with really not very thick walls. And I think the junkiest building in New York is Trump Towers, which is sort of the model of shoddiness, which they call luxury and very high price. So basically, I saw the importance of finance and real estate. None of that was discussed in the university at all. The pretense is that money's created by banks lending to people who build factories and employ labor to produce more, and somehow credit is all productive because it finances productive investment. Well, that was the hope in the 19th century, and it actually was the reality in Germany and in Central Europe, where you had banking becoming industrialized. But after World War II, you had a snap back into the Anglo-Dutch American kind of banking, which was really just merchant banking. It was banking to lend against assets already in place. So I realized that the story of the statistics that I worked on were the exact opposite. of what I was taught. And I simply had to go through the motions of going through the orals and writing about this. I wrote my dissertation on the history of economic thought because anything that I'd write about the modern economy would simply drive the professors nutty. Needless to say, none of the academic professors ever actually worked in the real world, and it was all very theoretical. So that basically is how I came to realize that the whole 19th century fight for 100 years, we can call it the long 19th century, from the French Revolution all the way up to World War I, from the French physiocrats to Adam Smith to Ricardo and Malthus and John Stuart Mill, then to Marx and Simon Patten and Thorstein Veblen. The whole essence of classical economics was its value and price theory. And the whole purpose of value and price theory was to define the excess of market price over actual cost value. And that difference was economic rent. So the whole essence of classical economics had a political campaign, and the political campaign was that of industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalism was radical because it realized that in order to make Britain or France or Germany or any country competitive with other countries, you had to get rid of the landlord class and its demands for economic rent. And you had to get rid of monopolies and economic rent. You had to get rid of all payments of income that were not necessary for production. You wanted to bring prices in line with the actual cost value of production and not include this rake-off to unproductive investment, unproductive labor. And that was land rent, monopoly rent, and financial interest charges. Those were the three categories of rent that were the focus of all classical economics at the time. And that led to a political reform. How do you get rid of the landlord class? Well, you don't simply say they're not necessary, because the landlord class says, well, what are you going to do about it? Well, the proponents of industrial capitalism said, given the constitution of England, France, America, we've got to have the government power pass laws to free economies from economic rent. And in order to do that, we need democratic reform. In England, you had to build up the House of Commons over the House of Lords. And this became a constitutional crisis in 1909 and 1910 when Parliament passed a land tax, and that was rejected by the House of Lords. The crisis was resolved by saying the Lords could never again reject a revenue act passed by the House of Commons. So that political reform was part and parcel with the economic theory defining rent as the unnecessary cost of production. Well, this seemed to be very productive, but it began to falter already by 1848, when you had revolutions in almost every European country. The revolutions really were not fully democratic in the sense they weren't really for labor, wage labor, which was the bulk of society. It was sort of a bourgeois revolution. It was all for land reform. It was all for getting rid of the landed aristocracy and the special privileges that the aristocracy held, but they were not very interested in reforms of helping consumers, helping labor's working conditions, shortening the work week, shortening the workday, promoting safety. There was nothing really about public health or public social infrastructure spending. So things began to falter by 1848. They still made progress through the balance of the 19th century. And by the time World War I broke out in 1914, it looked like the world was moving towards socialism. And almost everybody in the 19th century, across the political spectrum, whatever you were doing, that was called socialism. Socialism meant essentially you collect the economic rent and you get rid of the landlords, and getting rid of the aristocracy would create a viable industrial economy. So you had libertarian socialism, you had Marxist socialism, you had anarchist socialism, you had industrial socialism, you had Christian socialism. You could have a bookshelf of books all with this, and everybody wanted, that was a label that everybody was looking at. The question is, what kind of socialism were you going to have? And in a way, that was what the aftermath of World War fought about. And it was largely triggered by the Russian Revolution, which unfortunately went rather tragically wrong under Stalin, which gave socialism and communism a bad name, but had a good name in England after World War II and in America already in the 1930s as a result of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal that saved capitalism by investing in public infrastructure. I can give you an example of where theory was in the 1890s in the United States. The industrial interests in America had a problem once the Civil War ended in 1865. They wanted to create an industrial society that was going to be a fair society with rising living standards. How do you do that without training people? You need to train people in a university. You had to teach them economics and how it worked. Well, the main universities in America were religious colleges or founded to train the clergy. Yale, Harvard, Princeton, and all of them were British free trade theory, economic theory. So the business interests and the government said, we've got to have reality economics. We're not going to try to reform the existing universities. The economics departments are unreformable. So we're going to create new universities. And all through America, each state was given a land grant. And the land grant was to enable them to create their own universities where they would teach reality economics and they would teach economic history and they would teach how the world actually worked. And most of all, they'd treat protectionist doctrine. How do you create an economy that is more efficient than other economies? Well, the first business school in America was the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And the first economics professor was Simon Patten, a protectionist. And Simon Patten said, if you're going to make industrial products compete those of England and Europe, now what you need is public infrastructure spending. So you need as much of the cost of living as possible to not to be paid by the employers, but to be paid by the government. For instance, we're going to have public roads, and the roads will lower the cost of doing business. And every time you build a road or a railroad, you're going to have the land values going up. And you can simply self-finance all of these by taxing them, and you'll have public education, and that will be free so that you don't have, like today, if you have a job, you have to earn enough money to pay an enormous student debt of a few $100,000. Well, if the government would provide free education, you wouldn't have to pay workers enough to pay the student debt. Today, 18% of America's national income is from medical insurance. Well, if you had, as England had public health after World War II, if you had public health here, as Bernie Sanders advocates, then you wouldn't have to pay workers a high enough salary to afford this enormous medical expense. Well, already in England, they realized this in the 1870s and 80s when Benjamin Disraeli campaigned as a conservative for health, all is health. So the movement towards public infrastructure, towards government spending, was led by the industrialists, not by the working class. It was the industrialists themselves that wanted strong government. And the common denominator of politics from, again, Adam Smith through all of the 19th century was in order to free economies from the unnecessary economic rent, to free them from unearned income, to free them from the free lunch, you have to have a government strong enough to take on the vested interests in essentially the landlord class in the House of Lords and the financial class behind it.
So just to clarify that, Michael, I know in some of your writing, you view the public sector as a fourth means of production. So we now have land, labor, capital, and the public sector.
That was the word that Simon Patten used, that a government infrastructure is a fourth means of production. But what makes it different from profits and wages is if you're a wage earner, you want to make as high a wage as possible. If you're a capitalist, you want to make as high a profit as possible. But the job of public investment as a means of production is not to make an income, not to do what it's done under Thatcher and Tony Blair, not to treat public utilities, education and health, as profit-making opportunities, but you want to measure their productivity by how much they lower the cost of doing business and the cost of living to the economy at large.
So if a country is good at that they educate their citizens, they lower transportation costs and help the workforce remain mobile, and this allows us to compete against other nations who are currently ahead of us in economic development terms, which means that we're not going to be stuck at a lower level of economic development where we're basically working for someone else or they're taking our resources for an unfair price. So instead we'll be able to develop as a nation, and by doing it collectively we can minimize the cost using the natural monopoly power that's in government hands to provide efficient services across your board. Is that your thinking? Is that right?
Yes, but they went further because the protectionists in America said the way to minimize costs, and it may seem an oxymoron, the way you minimize costs is with high wage labor. You raise the wages of labor, you raise the living standards, because high paid labor, highly educated labor, well-fed labor, well-rested labor is more productive than pauper labor. So they said very explicitly, yes, America is going to be a high wage economy. We're not like Europe, but our high wages are going to provide high enough living standards to provide high labor productivity. And as our high labor productivity, shorter working day, better working conditions, healthy working conditions, public health, well-educated, that's going to undersell countries that don't have an active public sector.
And Henry Ford being the poster boy for that approach, right, of doubling his employees' salaries and so on.
Yes. Now, needless to say, the fight for the kind of democracy that will free economies from economic rent was not easy. And already by the late 1980s, and especially the 1990s, you had the rentiers fighting back. In America, the fight was led by J.B. Clark. There was a movement, which today is called neoliberalism, to deny classical economics. Clark said, everything the classical economists have written is wrong. There is no such thing as unearned income. Economic rent does not exist. Whatever a businessman makes, he earns. Whatever a landlord makes, he earns. There is no unearned income. Well, all this came to a head around 1890. There was a publication, the Journal of Ethics, and Clark translated his books on economics into this article. And it was followed by Simon Patton, the protectionist economics professor, refuting them all and saying there's an attempt by academic economics, especially in New York City, at Columbia University, where Clark had ended up, to fight against the concept of economic rent. This is really the dividing line. Either you recognize that much of society the economy is unearned income, and you want to get rid of it, and you want to pass laws that will tax away the unearned income, or better yet, you put natural monopolies into the public domain where the public sector can directly do prices. And of course, that was what Teddy Roosevelt was going to do with his trust funding.
Michael, I just want to say reading your work is something of a revelation. I have a degree in economics for what it's worth, and I wouldn't say it was very much, to be honest. Your work gave me a totally new view of people like Thorstein Veblen. I got a degree in the 1990s, and the only thing I had in my economics degree was his concept of conspicuous consumption. We never explored his work on the damage done by absentee landlords, which I know is pivotal when you go back and look at his work properly. And also in your book, J for Junk Economics, you talk about the concept of free lunch and how Milton Friedman said there's no such thing as a free lunch, which on my economics degree was all about opportunity cost. But when you look at your work, you prove that actually there is a free lunch for some people, and he's the one who's having it. Most business ventures seek such free lunches not entailing actual work or real production cost, and to deter public regulation or higher taxation of rent-seeking recipients of free lunches. They have embraced Milton Friedman's claim that there's no such thing as a free lunch. You also say, even more aggressively, rent extractors accuse governments of taxing their income to subsidize freeloaders, pinning the label of free lunches on public welfare recipients. The actual antidote to free lunch is to make governments strong enough to tax economic rent and to keep the potential rent extracting opportunities and natural monopolies in the public domain.
Well, Veblen and Lee indeed was the last great classical economist. He coined the term neoclassical economics. And that's an unfortunate term. When I went to school in my 20s, I thought neoclassical meant, oh, it's a new version of classical economics. And it's not at all. What Veblen meant was there used to be the old classical economics of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Marx, and that was all about economic rent and exploitation. Neo means there's a new body of completely different post-classical economics pretending to be classical economics, and that is the new classical economics of today. So it was he should have used the word post-classical or anti-classical economics.
Is it now even pseudo-classical, right? So we know that it's
antithetical. Absolutely antithetical, because if the root of classical value and price theory was to isolate and define economic rent statistically, then denying economic rent denies the whole of value and price theory. And this is where economics became untracked. Unfortunately, it became untracked largely by Henry George, by rejecting classical economics. And George essentially became very quickly a follower of J.B. Clark and accepted this sort of mushy value theory and price theory, removing from value theory all elements to cost of production, not analyzing prices simply in terms of consumer demand and what people want, not analyzing what made asset prices, which of course most wealth is asset prices. George became very popular, rightly, as a journalist, wrote wonderful journalism to expose the railroads, California, the railroads as landlords. He wrote a wonderful book on the Irish land question, but then he tried to talk about the whole economy, and he didn't want any competition. He said, economics begins with me. Forget everything Adam Smith and classical economics says, follow me. And he's sort of an early Margaret Thatcher. There's no such thing as a society or the economy.
What are you doing, Michael? You're destroying my view of Henry George. An early Margaret Thatcher? How can that possibly be?
Well, here's in two ways. Let me say, the first way is, remember in the 19th century, in order to tax the land rent, you have to take on the most powerful vested interests of all, the real estate interests and the financial interests. And Henry George was a libertarian. He was for small government. He broke with the socialists because he warned that socialism had a potential for authoritarianism. Well, we know he was right in that warning because we saw what happened in Stalinist Russia. But obviously what you want is a government that is strong and democratic, but not authoritarian. And that was the ideal of America. But you had to have a strong enough government so that Teddy Roosevelt could come in and be able to bust the trusts. In 1913-14, the American income tax, that the whole income tax fell on 1% of the population, almost entirely on economic rent, on land rent, on mineral rent, and on monopoly rent for the big corporations. If you're a libertarian, you're for a government too small to take on the vested interests, and you'll never win. You'll end up like the Social Democrats or like today's Labor Party under Mr. Starmer, not be able to be very efficient. So that was the first problem. The second problem was when George said, all you have to do is tax the land and everything else will take care of itself. Well, as you know, he was nominated as a celebrity candidate by the socialist and labor groups in New York City in 1876 to run for mayor. And they gave him the program. You have to have safe housing, workers' housing. You have to have safe working conditions. You have to have food laws that prevent people using poison, like you don't want to use chromium for cake frosting in order to make it yellow. Well, George threw out the whole labor program and said, no, there's only one thing that matters. And that if you tax the land rent, the cakes will take care of themselves. The worker safety and condition will take care of themselves. You don't need socialism, just do land rent. Well, the word panacea came into use in the English language at that time because he didn't see the economy as a whole. And that was the whole tragedy. He was great as a journalist describing rent and the machinations of the railroads and the other people. But once he tried to talk about the economy without really knowing much, without describing how the economy worked as a system, saying there really isn't any economic system. It's just all about land rent. That separated him from the other reformers. But by the 1890s, You had many reformers in America who were actually inspired by George's journalism in the 70s and early 80s. And the attacks on the oil monopoly, on the Rockefellers, all of this. And they said, what happened to him? What happened? Well, he became a sectarian. He formed his own party and said, we're only going to talk about land rent. And he diverted attention away from how the overall economy works. And if you don't understand how the economy is all about providing a free lunch in one way or another, not to landlords today, but to the financial sector primarily, then you're really not going to address the interests of most of the population. And that's what happened. His party shrunk quite a bit. All down to the first decade of the 20th century, you had followers of Henry George and socialists going around the country debating each other. Great debates. They really spelled out the whole problem. I wanted to reprint all of these debates somewhere because the socialists and the Georgists said, well, one thing we can agree on, society is going to go either your way or our way. We're talking about how is the future of the political system and the economic relations and taxes that follow from this system. How are they going to evolve? The socialists, needless to say, focused more and more on labor's working conditions because they were getting worse and worse in America. The fight for labor unionization got quite violent and corrupt. The abuse of consumers, the growth of monopolies, all of these were growing problems. And the socialists said, okay, we're going to focus on these problems. Let's leave the discussion of rent to followers of George. I think that was very unfortunate because what George did was pry the discussion of economic rent away from the mainstream political discussion, which was socialist. And I found very little interest in today's socialist movement or the socialist movement 50 years ago in the land rent issue. They were concerned about international issues, about war, about almost everything except land rent. And today I find the greatest interest in rent theory and translating it into a tax system and an overall economic system to be in China. So that's really where the debate over how are you going to keep the price of housing down by keeping the financial sector from just trying to capitalize the land rental income into a bank loan. That's the big fight in China today, and to a lesser extent in Russia. Fred Harrison in the early 1990s brought a group of people, including me, over to Russia. We made 2 trips to the Duma. We did everything we could to say, look, Russia, you can have a great advantage to rebuild your industry and make it a productive economy. The first thing you want to do is make sure that you keep housing prices down. You want to give everybody their houses. If you give them all their houses free and clear, they don't have any debt. And then we know that some places are going to be more valuable than others. Then you'll have the lowest priced economy in the world because in America, the rent can take up to 43% of labor's income. Well, there was some pushback from the Russians. They said, how can you have rent in a socialist economy? Well, Ted Gwartney, an American real estate appraiser, walked down the street of St. Petersburg with the local mayor, and Vladimir Putin was in the meeting, Ted tells me, and he walked down the street and he said, look, it was, I think, a fall or winter day. He said, you'll notice one side of the street is very sunny. The other street is in the shade. That's how the sun is in the northern latitudes in winter. You notice that everybody is walking on the sunny side of the street. That means that if you're going to have a store, whether it's a bakery or a food store or a restaurant, the store on the sunny side of the street is going to be able to attract more customers and have what we call economic rent more than the other side of the street. Same thing with buildings. They're a very nice apartment building in good repair will be more than that is near a subway is going to be worth more than something that's far away from the subway. Well, the mayor said, well, okay, I get the commercial side of the street, but how do we actually make a land value tax so that we can collect this? And what Ted did was brilliant. He said, this St. Petersburg, the layout reminds me of Boston. So here's a land map. We have a land value map of Boston, and there's a center of values right near the subway, and then it gets lower and lower outside of the subway. Let's just apply that as a scale model and roughly go from there in St. Petersburg. Well, Russia could have been a low-cost economy. It could have kept the oil and the Gazprom nickel resources, could have kept all that in the public domain to fund the investment in reindustrialization so that it could become independent of the West. Well, as we all know, Ted and the people that Fred Harrison bought are completely overwhelmed by the billions of dollars spent on promoting kleptocracy and shock therapy in Russia. And it wasn't only Russia. I brought Ted Gortney along with his mathematical advisor over to Latvia, where I was the economic research director of the Riga Graduate School of Law. And I was asked by the leading political party of Latvia, the Center Party, which was basically the Russian-speaking party, which had 1/3 of the votes, to draw up a model for how Latvia could industrialize. Well, Ted brought his advisor over to the tax authorities and the housing authorities, had a nice meeting there, and they were amazed. They said, "Oh, this is great. We can hire a separate appraiser for every single building. This will really create employment." No, he said, in America, people who do what I do, and Ted was, I think, the appraiser for Greenwich, Connecticut, which is the wealthiest city in Connecticut. He said, "We can do a whole city in about 1 week." And this, they couldn't believe it in Latvia. Well, shortly after, there was a meeting of the Eastern Economics Association, and the Schachenbach Foundation had a meeting of political critics of Henry George. So there were a lot of Georges there. And the other people who came to the Eastern Economic Association meeting, which was largely created by John Kenneth Galbraith, were socialists. And my friend, who was the assistant to the mayor of London, at that time, Ken Livingstone was the mayor of London, and his assistant was Alan Freeman. So everybody was having lunch after the economic meetings, and I brought Alan over to sit down with Ted Gortney. And Ted was saying what he did. And Alan said, "Oh my God, I've never heard of this." Then he came, I've got to come and meet Ted Gortney. And he came to New York. We went up to Ted Gortney's house in Connecticut. Ted explained how you make a land value map. And this is to the assistant of the mayor of London, who wanted, initially, we talked about their hiring me as the advisor. And Alan said, "You should win the Nobel Prize for this. This is amazing. This is something." And Ted said, "You know, there are about 20,000 appraisers in America that do this. This is what we do. It's all their ways of doing it. It's all statistics. You can all look it up. Every city has a land value map. That's easy to do. That's what we do mathematically by smoothing out the changes." And Alan couldn't believe it. Well, I went back to London shortly with Alan, and it turned out that the political pressures in England, especially from the Labour Party, they had a real estate company do the appraisal. So we never got to do our version of real estate appraisal of London, and so that we could really calculate the rent. But this is what all of the theories of the physiocrats, Adam Smith, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Marx, Veblen, Alfred Marshall, all of them were focusing on this. And now this idea is so alien that from London to St. Petersburg, they don't have any idea of how this simple concept can be done, because the economics profession is in denial. It's followed the idea that there's no such thing as unearned income. Everybody gets what they make. And so the result of this is how countries calculate their national income accounts, the national income and product accounts, NEPA, or the GDP accounts. And if you look at the GDP accounts for the United States, and I've published a number of articles on my website, and they're in major economic journals, to break down what is the GDP. Well, suppose it's easiest to see in real estate and finance. In real estate, the government, Department of Labor Statistics, and other agencies go and ask homeowners, what would the rental income of your home be if you rented out to yourself? If you were a landlord and rented yourself, how much rent would that be? And so they have owners imputed rent, and that's 8% of GDP. That's a lot of GDP, 8%. It's very heavily growing. Well, it's not really income because nobody gets it, but they have to do this because they want to describe all of the income that landlords make is contributing to GDP. They say landlords provide a productive service. They provide housing to people who need it, and they provide commercial properties to businesses that need it. Well, that's not exactly how John Stuart Mill put it when he said rent is what landlords make in their sleep. How do you explain how productive landlords are? Well, another element of America's GDP, and they keep changing this, is financial services. And I called up the Commerce Department where they make the statistics and said, what happens when credit card companies increase their interest charges? Credit card companies in America make about $1 billion in interest a year, and another billion in late fees and penalties. Most of the income that credit card companies make are actually on the fees and penalties. And I said, where does that appear in the GDP? And they said, oh, that is financial services. So the service of calculating how far the debtors are behind in their payments is 29% is the rate that they end up paying. That's all a contribution to GDP. So the question is, what does income and product mean? Well, this again is back to what classical economics is all about. The product is the actual necessary cost of production, but there's a lot of income over and above the necessary cost of production. And that's economic rent, that's unearned income. That's land rent, monopoly rent, the natural resource rent, interest, and financial charges. And obviously, you want to say how much of what a society produces is actually a product. And the way that we classical economists look at things is land rent that you pay, the interest charges you pay, the monopoly prices you pay is a rake off from what you get. It's not all of your income equals product. Well, that's not so. Income doesn't equal product, because only a portion of that income is a product. In America, the head of Goldman Sachs a few years ago said, Goldman Sachs Partners, it's a predatory financial firm, that our partners make more money than anyone else in America because we're the most productive. And again, if you make a lot of money, by definition, you make it by being productive. That's the false identity.
That's really John Bates Clark's idea, that if you capture or make money, then you've earned it. If it's in your wallet, it's yours. And it's not because you're a gatekeeper or you're the troll under a bridge taking people's money as they cross, which is essentially what financial economics is about, isn't it?
Right. Well, I've spoken with a number of political advisors, many of whom were followers of Henry George. They've described to me how political all of this definition of the economy is. A number of friends of mine have been trying to work to show how much of what the United Nations calculates as income and product is actually economic rent. And we all publish that together. Steve Keen is one of them. There are a number of others who do it. And we publish in places like the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics and other things, but not the mainstream journals. Essentially, a lot of this was taught where I was a professor for decades. I guess I'm still a professor there at the University of Missouri at Kansas City. We found that our graduates had problems getting jobs because in order to get a job at a university, you have to publish articles in prestige magazines. Well, the University of Chicago, the Milton Friedman boys, the Chicago boys, control the editorial boards of all the prestige magazines, just like they control the Nobel Prize Committee that basically is given to Chicago boys every year for not explaining how the economy works. A precondition for what you call a Nobel Prize winning economist is not understanding how the economy works, because if you understand it, you're going to threaten the vested interests that are getting the free lunch. You have to say there's no such thing as a free lunch. Everybody earns whatever they get. The robbers and criminals like that idea. Yeah, we got it. We stole it fair and square. You can extend that over the economic spectrum and see that crime pays, but also rent-seeking pays. And you can get much more money quicker by extractive means, by rent extraction, than you can by actually investing in plant and equipment and developing products and marketing them and making a profit over time and spending on research and development. That's why in today's industrial economy in the United States, 92% of corporate revenue, called earnings, is spent on stock buybacks and dividend payouts, not on new capital investment like the textbooks say. So the way that the economy works today is no longer industrial capitalism. It's finance capitalism. And instead of industrial engineering, making society that produces more with all of the environmental protection cost included, instead of that, you have financial engineering of making wealth by increasing the stock prices. Wealth is achieved not by earning it. You don't save up your earnings and get wealthy. I think half of Americans are unable to raise $400 in an emergency. They have no savings at all. So it's really very hard to save up money, especially if you have student debt and credit card debt and medical debt and the mortgage debt. There's really nothing to be saved. So you have the 1% of society, the rentier portion that had to pay income tax back in 1914, getting huge amounts of income, and the rest of the society getting less and less and less. There's an economic polarization. The dynamics of society are financial. And basically, it's rent seeking that has been financialized. I'll give you another example of the GDP. One of the problems that makes GDP statistics meaningless is depreciation. This idea that buildings depreciate. When Ronald Reagan came in, basically, this was the real estate interests taking over the government. The Henry George and the libertarians are for central planning, but they're for central planning by Wall Street, by the financial interests. Every economy is planned. Every economy is steered. If you don't have a government strong enough to do the planning is done by the financial. They had their chance under Ronald Reagan. Under Reagan, you could pretend that if you buy a big commercial building, you can pretend that write off 1/7 of the entire cost every single year. And at the end of 7 years, you change your ownership from one name to another name and you start it all over again. The same building can be redepreciated again and again. Donald Trump wrote in his autobiography, he loves depreciation because he said, thanks to the pretense of depreciation, my buildings are all going up in value and I get to pretend they're falling and that I get to deduct all of that depreciation from my income tax. And so it's actually economic rent. So if you look at the national income statistics, you can't find economic rent in them at all. It doesn't appear. I was able to piece it together by adding, what is it that goes into economic rent? Well, certainly real estate taxes are part of economic rent. Interest payments, because interest is paid out of economic rent. The depreciation actually should be there. But the government nowhere in the national income statistics says how much is actually charged for depreciation. They have a dummy, because if they showed that, the whole economy would think, wait a minute, this is a giveaway. This is utterly unrealistic. And so they pretend that we're going to only put for depreciation what we think the buildings are actually depreciating over a period of 20 or 25 years. It's a completely fictitious number. And so you have a fictitious type of national income accounting that makes it impossible to actually go and calculate what the economic rent is, the economic rent that was the whole focus of classical economics. So how are you going to get a statistical system that actually reflects this? Well, one associate of mine, Jacob Assa, ASSA, has done quite a few books on this, criticizing economic rent. He works for the United Nations here in New York, or didn't until quite recently. Now he's teaching. You have people who are capable of doing this, but as I said, our graduates couldn't. You can't publish this in the University of Chicago economic journals because they say there's no such thing as economic rent, just like there's no such thing as society. Now, I had wanted to publish statistics on this, and at a certain point, the Henry George School asked me to make statistics of what rent was and of land value, and I found out that the value of land, the market price of land in the United States, was twice what the government reported it as. The government pretends that buildings keep growing in value, even though there's depreciation. They pretend that buildings are growing in value, and whatever is left after you take the original cost of the building, you multiply it by the construction price index, and whatever is left is the land value. Well, in 1994, if you were to ask what's the land value of all of the commercially owned real estate in the United States, what do you think it was? It was negative $4 billion. In other words, we will give you all of the land that every corporation owns in the United States, but you'll have to accept the $4 billion that it is in deficit for. This is crazy. The statistics are drawn up by the real estate interests. When I calculated this, the Georgists in America got furious. They said, this is awful. You're showing that rents and land value and rents are much higher than we thought. If you did this, people are going to want to tax them. We represent the developers. Our followers in the Georgist movement are the local mayors. In order to influence local mayors, their big funders are the real estate interests in their campaigns. We represent the developers. We want to save society by having the developers build up those slums, build up those vacant lots. That'll save civilization. You don't need to worry about ecology. You don't need to worry about workers' conditions. You don't need to worry about anything about let's build up those vacant lots. Well, that's when I was told if I publish these statistics, I can never have any relations with Schockenbach or the Henry George School again. So I published them in Harper's Magazine in a cover story and lived happily ever after.
Was that the new road to serfdom? The article in Harper's, was that the new road to serfdom?
Yes. We're in the new road to serfdom because the purpose of industrial capitalism was to free economies from the legacy of feudalism. And the legacy of feudalism was the landlord warrior class collecting hereditary rents and the predatory banks that were not making loans for industry. None of the industrialists got their money to invest in banks. The inventors of the steam engine couldn't get money. They had to mortgage their houses. Banks don't lend money.
And this is all included in your latest book, which has just come out, called The Destiny of Civilization, Finance Capitalism, Industrial Capitalism or Socialism, which I gather was a series of lectures to a Chinese university. Is that correct?
Yes. And there are 168,000 viewers of the first lecture in the first week. There's just a huge interest in this in China because they realize we don't need higher housing prices. Right now, what is pushing up housing prices in China? It's the amount of money that banks will lend against the property. And if you have a land tax, the land tax will actually keep the prices of housing down because as China gets more productive and more prosperous, people are going to be able to afford housing. And housing is really how you define a person's status. If something gets more valuable because of public investment in transportation, schools nearby, or parks nearby, that's going to make it more valuable. But if you tax it, then you're going to keep the actual housing price down. And what you're paying for is the economic rent. The economic rent is the payment that pays for all of these. Fred Harrison and Riley wrote that book, Taken for a Ride, where they show that all of the money that London spent on extending the Jubilee line increased real estate prices by twice as much all along the line. They could have simply collected the value that this public investment created, as Simon Patton pointed out, and made it self-financing. Instead, it was all a giveaway. And they had to end up taxing labor and business. And that obviously increased Britain's cost of living and hence the cost of production, which is why Britain has been deindustrializing. And it's been deindustrializing because despite the attempt through 1909 and 10 to free itself from landlordism, it freed itself from landlordism only to have the bankers taking the place of the landlords and being the class today that was what the landlords were in the 19th century. And so we're back on the revival of what really was feudalism, a rake-off by a hereditary privileged class.
So Michael, I wonder if we could get into super imperialism and the work you did, first of all, for the book, first published in 1972, and for the first edition, and I know we had a third edition come out in 2021. So I just wanted to look at your understanding of the balance of payments deficit and how that was caused by American military spending, your advice to the US State Department on how they could force countries to take US-backed securities to finance that expenditure. But also, I just wonder, when we get into the current de-dollarization challenge that we're now facing, due in part to the conflict in Ukraine and America's reaction to Russia because of that. I just wonder what background we need to give our listeners to explain how that system works.
Well, one of the things that people really don't understand is money. until 1971, when countries would run a balance of payments deficit, they would have to settle it either in gold or they'd have to sell off their industry to creditors, to investors in the payment surplus countries. Well, beginning with the war in Korea in 1950, 1951, the US balance of payments moved into deficit. The entire balance of payments deficit of the United States from the Korean War to the 1970s was a result of its foreign military spending. Well, as the Vietnam War was ending, moving towards its end, the Americans had to give away gold every single month. Vietnam had been a French colony, and so the banks there were French. And so as America would spend more dollars in Southeast Asia, these dollars would be sent from the bank branches to their head office in Paris, and the Paris bank would turn over the dollars to the central bank for France, and the central bank under General de Gaulle would then say, here are dollars, give us gold. Germany was doing exactly the same thing, was using its export proceeds that would be paid in dollars, it would turn the dollars over for gold. So America's gold stock was steadily going down, and it had to withdraw from the London gold pool. It stopped making the dollar convertible. By 1950, when the Korean War began, the American Federal Treasury had 75% of the world's monetary gold, and it used this monetary power to control diplomacy in other countries. The basis of America's political power was its gold stock. Well, once they stopped the gold standard, there was a hand-wringing saying, how are we going to dominate the world if we don't have gold anymore? If the military spending abroad has made us run out of gold. Well, what I said, well, once countries, foreign central banks are going to get these dollars, they can't cash them in for gold. What are they going to use them for? Well, there's only one thing that central banks at that time did, and that was to buy government securities. So central banks of France and Germany and other payment surplus countries would buy treasury bills, treasury bonds. Some of these were special bonds that they couldn't sell, but they were stores of value. And so all the money that America was spending abroad was simply recycled to the United States. It didn't mean that America had to devalue the dollar for running a balance of payments deficit like today's global South countries do, or as England had to do with its stop-go policies, always raising the interest rates to borrow.
And Michael, this insight, was that when you were working at Chase Manhattan and you were advising the State Department on what to do with this balance of payments problem because of military?
At Chase, my job was to analyze basically the balance of payments of third world countries and then of the oil industry. So I had to develop an accounting format to find how much did the oil industry, if you segregate it, actually make from the rest of the world. I had to calculate natural resource rent and how large it was. So I did that from 1964 till about 1967. Then I had so much work to do there, I had to quit to finish my dissertation to get the PhD. And then I developed the system of balance of payments analysis that actually was the way it had been calculated before GDP analysis. I went to work for Arthur Andersen for a year, calculating the whole US balance of payments. That's where I found that it was all military in character. And I began to write in popular magazines like Ramparts. America's going to be running out of gold. This is the price that America is paying for its military spending abroad is a loss of its economic power. Well, but then I realized as soon as it went off gold in 1971, that America had a cost-free means of military spending. Suppose you were to go to the grocery store and just pay in IOUs. And you could tell the owner, the grocer, well, I don't have any money to actually pay you the IOUs, but maybe you can give it to the farmers and the dairy people for products you get. And everybody else will use this as money. And you'll continue to get your groceries for free. Well, that's how the United States economy works under the dollar standard, or at least it's how it's worked until the present. This is what led China and Russia and Iran and other countries to say, we don't want America to have a free ride, because all of these IOUs that it's giving, it uses to surround us with military bases, to overthrow us and to threaten to bomb us if we don't do what America tells us to do. So that led already a few years ago to pressure to de-dollarize the economy and to make a multipolar world economy, not the whole world economy being an extension of the US Defense Department really the US economy and US mining firms and oil companies and others, but to actually let other countries keep their economic surplus among themselves to promote their own economic growth instead of imposing IMF dictated austerity programs to impose austerity so that they can pay foreign bondholders. Everybody thought that it's going to take years and years for China, Russia, Iran, India, Indonesia to get their act together and to really create an alternative. But this year, the Biden administration has destroyed America's free lunch. First, he grabbed Venezuela's foreign exchange. Then he grabbed all of the foreign exchange of Afghanistan, just confiscated it. And then a month ago, he confiscated $300 billion of Russia's foreign exchange and said, if you've lent money to the US, we can grab whatever we want because we get to dictate to you who will be your president. We are the one democracy in the world. Democracy means America's military gets to appoint your president. And so we don't like the person you've voted in as president for Venezuela. We're going to hire this little nitwit that we bought out, Guaido, and we're going to appoint him president. And we're going to take away all of your gold and we're going to give it to the person that we, America, as the bastion of democracy, says should be president so that he can spend it on hiring terrorist groups to kill all of you land reformers, to kill your labor leaders, to finance a neo-Nazi takeover there, just like we did in Chile under Pinochet, and just like we've done in Ukraine with funding the neo-Nazis to fight against the Russians there. So this is essentially shocked the rest of the world. Nobody assumed or believed that countries would actually grab other countries' financial savings. If you go back to the wars in the 19th century, the Crimean War and the other wars, it was pretty much of a war-free period under the Victorian era. But even when there were wars, countries would continue to pay their foreign debts and financial obligations. All of this was ended by President Biden, who said, we are rejecting the international rule of law. We have a rules-based order. We can make up the rules. Number one, we're exempt from the rules. Only you have to follow them. Number two, the rules are whatever we say. And this has done what China, Russia, India would have taken years to develop by themselves. It's impelled them to create a new economic order independently of the United States and Europe, which is a satellite currency of the United States.
So, Michael, this crazy situation that we've got is to recognize that even if you have deposits in a bank, the deposits don't really belong to you.
Well, they don't belong to you, but they can be stolen.
So they're kind of mine, but not, right? And so to give people a local analogy, what's gone on is if I annoyed the wrong person at home in my hometown, for example, my local mayor or my local MP, then I could have my car impounded or even my house confiscated, which is essentially what's happened to the Russian oligarchs. Now, I'm not saying that the oligarchs deserve their $500 million yacht. I suspect they didn't, but it was technically theirs. And America is showing everyone that if you piss them off, then they will take your resources, which is what's happened throughout time, right? And the British did it, and we appropriated resources and stole stuff from other nations. I guess if we want the best examples of that, we can go to the very beautiful British Museum and see all the artifacts we've appropriated. So what's your take on the economic impact and reactions to the conflict in the Ukraine?
Europe has committed economic suicide. The United States asked its leaders, we have a deal for you. We'll give you a lot of money in your offshore account. We will make sure that your kids get free education in the United States, but you have to represent the United States, not Germany, not France, not other countries. And the Americans have been meddling, is the word they use, with the European politics. The European politicians do not represent their own countries. They represent the American State Department and American diplomacy. And they were told, we want to make sure that we lock you into our economy. The Europeans had an idea that Americans really hated, and it was just an awful un-American idea. The Europeans, after 1991, thought that now that communism's over, now we can invest in Russia, we can make money investing there, they can sell our goods, and we can make mutual gains off each other. This drove the Americans crazy. They said, no, we want to make the money off Russia. We want our people to come in and buy the companies. We want to essentially make sure that the rent yielding natural resources are given to kleptocrats that can only make their money by sending it abroad to England or to the United States and the people in our area. So essentially, they've asked Europe to not buy Russian gas, but to spend 7 times as much on buying American liquefied natural gas and spend $5 billion on building the ports to accept this gas and go without gas for about 3 or 4 years, let their pipes freeze, stop making fertilizer, don't feed your land, take it on the chin for America. We want your standard of living is going to have to drop by 20%, but it's all for American democracy. And the European head said, that's fine. So the one thing that America said that especially Europe, as few Europeans are bothering the Americans about, is you're trying to stop global warming. And that's a direct attack on the whole central of power of the United States, which is the oil industry. The oil industry controls almost all of the world oil trade. It's the highest rent yielding industry in the world. It's tax-free. It's very politically powerful. And as long as America can control the oil trade, it can talk to Latin American countries or African countries and say, if you elect a leader that we don't like, we can put a sanction on you and we can stop exporting oil to you and we can freeze you out and you won't get fertilizer and we can starve you out. We'll put a sanction on your food trade. And next to oil, agriculture is America's biggest trade surplus item.
And what they're doing with the conflict in Ukraine, Russia is there also, and China as well, is that they're the other major sources of grain, wheat, rice that the world uses.
Well, I must say, I read the British papers, especially the Financial Times, regularly, and there's complete disinformation. On today's paper, for instance, you had President Biden saying Putin is creating a world food shortage and famine because Ukraine can't export its grain. What Ukraine did at American direction is put mines all over the Black Sea. So the whole Black Sea and all the ports have mines around them that will, if a ship hits it, it'll blow a hole in the hull and it'll sink. Well, as a result of that, if you're a shipping company and you want to send grain in, you have to get insurance, because if you don't have insurance, then you're in danger of going bust if your ship goes under. And no insurance company will insure it until the Ukrainians remove the mines that they put. And you need minesweepers for that. Needless to say, Russia doesn't want American minesweepers in because there's a war on. And so you have basically the United States blocking Ukrainian grain exports, which was a huge export. You've had the American dollar area, the NATO countries are refusing to import food agriculture from Russia. And Russia is the world's largest agricultural exporter, with Ukraine following up. So essentially, you're creating a crisis for global South countries, for Latin America. Advocates of global warming, the Green Party in Germany, its policy is we want global warming faster. We want to accelerate global warming. They are the main lobbyists for the air polluters. Who's the largest air polluter is the American military. The Green Party is the pro-military, the pro-war policy. They're the one, Baerbock and the others in Germany say, you know, we've got to fight Russia more. We've got to provide it with more arms. We've got to fight. They're supporting the military that is now the largest new contributor to global warming. And Europe is willing to say, okay, we are willing to have the sea levels rise another 10 feet as long as we can help America dominate Russia. Well, and we're willing not to make money from Russia ourselves. It's okay. America can make all the money. We don't mind paying more for American goods. We understand that America will put tariffs on us, so we can't export more for America. We realize we're going to have to reindustrialize. Well, maybe we'll go back to the 19th century. Maybe Europe will become a country of farmers again, when everybody lived in a fairy tale world.
So, Michael, I just wonder if we can come back to what China and Russia can do, given their reserves. They understand they've got lots of gold and large grain stores. I think China's having the most, as I understand it. Can you help me understand what these nations around the world that have US dollar reserves in some form or other, most of it in bonds, can do? And I'm guessing that now they need to start selling those reserves because they're not worth what they used to be. So why is a dollar still increasing at the moment?
Well, because the euro is going down. The Japanese yen is going down. The yen is the worst performing currency. They've held their interest rates very low because they think this will enable the banks to make money by borrowing at a low rate and lending to foreign countries at a high rate. Well, Europe is also keeping its interest rates very low. The Federal Reserve is raising the interest rate. Now, as it raises the interest rate, money from low interest rate countries, Europe and Japan, are flowing to America. The currency values are primarily set by relative interest rates and by capital flows. They're not set by the cost of production for imports and exports. They're not caused by trade so much, unless there's a radical breakdown of trade. There's all these zigzags you see, short-term capital movements. And the capital movements, now that America says, we want you countries to keep your interest rates low so that your banks and financial investors will borrow from your banks cheaply and buy American securities that are yielding higher returns. And so it's a relative monetary policy. And as long as the euro is a satellite currency to the dollar, it's going to continue to go down. So both the euro and the British sterling are now moving towards a dollar per pound and a dollar per euro.
The long-term measure is that countries are going to start, if they can, to sell the bonds that they've got, the US currency that they've got, for something other than US currency. So long-term, it has to come down.
Yes. And what they're going to do is they're going to hold each other's currencies. Russia is denominating its exports in rubles instead of dollars. The American banks have lost the trade financing of the world oil trade, and certainly Russian oil trade and Russian agricultural trade. And countries will, instead of holding dollars, they'll hold ruble reserves to stabilize their currencies vis-a-vis the ruble. China's holding ruble reserves. The ruble's holding Chinese yen reserves. The balance will be held more and more in gold and some kind of assets without a liability attached to them. Much of what they get internationally, I think the logical direction in which this is moving is that the non-dollar countries will create their own international monetary fund version, their own World Bank, their own trade organization, and there will be one set of trade and financial and development organizations and military organizations in the EU and Europe, the NATO, the white countries, and another set of relations in the non-white countries, the countries that where they're actually developing, while America and Europe shrink and shrink and shrink.
So what's your assessment around how much gold China actually holds? Because the published numbers are really extraordinarily small, aren't they, for an economy that's so big?
I don't know. Any government can hold gold not only through its own treasury, but through subordinate agencies that can hold gold. So all I know is that they obviously saw what America did to Russia's dollar holdings, and they don't want the same thing done to them, since President Biden has said China is our number one enemy. He said, we want to destroy the Russian economy, and once we do that, we can attack China. We want to pry them apart. So obviously, China is reading the newspapers and saying, well, I guess we better avoid that fate.
The other thing that I find utterly remarkable is Biden in one speech says that he wants to get rid of Putin. The Secretary of State, Blinken, says that he wants to arm Taiwan. If I ran China and I said I wanted to arm Mexico, or if anyone in South America wants any weapons, my door is open to you, I would expect the Americans to be extremely upset with that because I'm breaching the Monroe Doctrine. So having been in the corridors of power, can you help me understand how politicians can be so delusional to think they can say stuff like that without having a negative consequence?
Well, you know who's really upset by that? The Taiwanese. They say, they want to make Taiwan into another Ukraine. They're willing to fight to the last Taiwanese, just like Ukraine has done. They say, wait a minute, we have two choices before us. If we do arm and get weapons that can hit China, then China's very likely to just to bomb us. On the other hand, I've met the Taiwanese officials for 40 years. Many of them say our long-term plan, we all expect to be reintegrated. We want to be investors in China. We want a merger, but we want a merger under our terms where we can be like Hong Kong, but at least be able to have our own merger that'll make us prosperous too. So now the choice between do we want to follow the Americans and become the Ukraine of the Pacific, or do we want to join with China as China's growing and America shrinking? What are we going to choose? I would imagine that you will see a very strong, peaceful integrationist movement with China developing. Now, the Americans think that the Taiwanese must hate China because they remember that Shanghai massacred the communists in 1927. They're still living in the past.
So what we're looking at then is because of the actions of whoever is in charge, whether it's President Biden or other people.
No, President Biden is just the front man. They're all the front man for the faceless people in the State Department, the neocons. Basically, It's the neocons that are controlling things. Biden's always been a right-wing, corrupt party politician, and all he does is do what he's paid to do. So he's unimaginative. He's brought in some real Russia haters. I mean, really people who have a visceral hatred of Russia because of their family background under the czars or under Blinken always said, my family were Jewish and we lost under the czars and under Stalin. I want to kill Russia because I'm so angry at what they did to my ancestors. This is the neocon mentality in a nutshell, and it's a crazy mentality. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury officials say they have not been even consulted in these political moves that Biden and Blinken and the neocons are making. They really are Russia haters and China haters, and there is a lot of racism there, as you're seeing in New York. It's very dangerous for Asian women to take a subway in New York. Almost every week, the lead news item is yet another Asian woman pushed in front of a subway or killed or attacked. There's a new race hatred in America. They treat the Russians as the Ukrainians do, as if the Slavic-speaking people are a separate race.
Extraordinary. So super imperialism, when it came out, as I understand it, it was used by the State Department to figure out how to continue running their economics and
yes,
how
they said, we thought it was going to be a disaster, and you've shown us that we've run rings around the British Empire, as my boss Herman Kahn put it. They hired me for the Hudson Institute, which is a national security institute, and brought me to the State Department for meetings with them, and brought me to Army war colleges and Air Force war colleges to talk about it. The main people who wanted to learn how imperialism works are, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, the imperialists. I actually thought that the anti-imperialists were going to be my main audience, but the imperialists really needed to know more than the anti-imperialists.
They took your book, Super Imperialism, and they read it as a love letter, right?
Not a love letter. I mean, they knew that my politics weren't theirs, but it was a good how to do it book. So I was the technician.
And working for Herman Kahn, because he's a powerful guy that people don't talk about so much anymore, right? But he was extraordinarily influential at the time, right?
Yes, he had a great sense of humor. He was a great speaker. He was absolutely brilliant. He wrote a book on thermonuclear war, saying that somehow, even if there is thermonuclear war, somebody's going to be left to survive. And that made him one of the models for Dr. Strangelove in the movie. I think when I would sit and hear Herman talk about military, I was awed by how he'd thought it all through. He was a brilliant military tactician. He would bring me together and sit down with generals, and they would explain things. I don't have a good military sense or any military training at all, but he wrote. He did say personally he wanted to be under the first hydrogen bomb. He didn't want to live in the nuclear world, but there would be some survivors somewhere, and I think that made him notorious. But then he was so reviled for even having brought up discussion of the topic that needed to be discussed, that he wanted to have something that people liked, and that was the corporate environment study. And that was what I was pretty much in charge of. I was the economist for the Hudson Institute. He was the military, and we had the same salary. We were equals there. And we would go around the world disagreeing with each other. It would be like a show. He'd talk about the world being a cup half full, and I'd talk about the cup being full empty, as he put it. And I'd talk about the debt overhead and how debt was growing and would ultimately stifle the economy. And he'd talk about how productivity would be sufficient to pay debt, although productivity doesn't necessarily give you the money to pay the debt. And productivity does not grow exponentially as debt grows. Any rate of interest is a doubling time, and it doubles quicker than the economy can double.
And this is really coming back to one of your initial questions from Terence McCarthy, which was to focus on productivity.
Yes, the idea was focusing on productivity. You realize that it all comes down to labor ultimately. How do you make labor more productive? How do you make industry more productive? You get rid of what is unproductive. The overhead is rent. How much of corporate spending is just plain overhead? How much is unnecessary for corporate industry to take place? That grounds you back in classical economics. And Marx is really the last great classical economist who pushed it all to the end. His contribution was saying, just as the landlord exploits in rent, the industrial capitalist exploits labor by charging more for the products of labor than it costs to hire labor to produce. However, unlike the rentier, unlike the landlord, the capitalist uses this economic surplus value to expand production, to build yet more factories, to expand yet more labor. And all of this is an expanding society, whereas the rent paid to the landlord is a kind of exploitation that is overhead and shrinks industrial capitalism. And that's why he said that the political message of industrial capitalism was basically to free society from the landlords and the bankers and the monopolists. And that's why the Communist Manifesto begins with collect rent for the public sector. You can tax the land as a transition to socializing the land. That was the Communist Manifesto, classical economics.
And you have these views, and yet you are still a welcome member and a valued member of the team at the Hudson Institute.
Yes, because I was explaining how the world worked. Herman and I disagreed so much. We were friendly, genuine friends. I liked them. And we couldn't believe that the other would actually believe something so different. But we said, okay, the argument that we're having is the big argument that's going to determine where the economy is going. Either he's right or I'm right, but people, and this is like the debates between the Henry George followers and the socialists in the early 1900s. It's going to be one world or another. What is the key to analyzing the economy? Is it to focus on finance and rent, or is it to focus on technological potential? Well, my point is technological potential can be smothered by so much overhead paid to the rentier class, to the fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, that there's no money left to invest, and there's no money for wage earners left to spend on buying the goods and services that they produce.
And yet the technology sector are new monopolists. In that sense, they're the new landowners. If I want to host these videos, then I've got to negotiate, or rather just accept the terms that the landowner YouTube offers. I'm posting them there, but I won't be making any money on it because I'm one of the serfs on YouTube.
Well, this is the problem that China is dealing with in its own way. What do you do when Jack Ma and other IT specialists end up billionaires? Well, China did not have an anti-monopoly group. It said, well, okay, we're going to let 100 flowers bloom. We're going to let billionaires develop, but we're going to have them just somehow transfer their money to the government one way or another. They haven't done this in the way that the Western economies do, by an anti-monopoly tax or by the tax system, but in a political consensus way. In the case of countries like Russia, I'm trying to get them to formalize this into a formally calculating the magnitude of economic rent and figuring out a way of taking it away. You want innovation to take place. You want people to make a fortune, but at a certain point, that's it. They can't somehow make such a big fortune that it ends up crushing the economy.
But looking at your writings from Byzantine times and the ancient Near East, what stands out is the importance of the leader of a particular economy or a society, and the importance of them being strong enough and powerful enough to deal with anybody and stop anybody getting rich enough to overthrow them. So in modern times, someone like Zuckerberg and the power he was able to wield in the election, regardless of whether you agree with his politics or not, that for me is extraordinarily worrying. And likewise, if you look at the fight that's currently going on with Elon Musk and Twitter, what people are actually saying is we want our own people who agree with us to control these so-called or alleged private assets, but they've actually got tremendous social power, and so there really ought to be some kind of public oversight.
Yes, they financialized politics in America by the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling. Anyone can contribute as much as they want. The rentier interests have given the pro-rentier politicians, their puppets, the advertising airtime on television and the media in order to overwhelm all of the people who would want to minimize the rentier class. So essentially, you financialize politics. America much more than has occurred in Europe. But in Europe, it's the right wingers basically that control most of the newspaper, the press, the commercial television and media. So if the media are controlled by the right wing with their own agenda, they frame the economic issues from the vantage point of the rentier class instead of from the vantage point of how does an economy actually develop and grow wealthier in a fair manner.
So I know we do need to wrap up. I'm just thinking about the scenarios for Russia and China currently. So everybody who was part of the original white economies of Europe realizes that if they don't side with America, they get overthrown. But also right now, they've got the short-term challenge that if the Americans are going to let them starve because they're stopping wheat exports coming through the European ports, we've also got Russia with resources. You've got China with grain resources. So there's a potential that if people start to starve, and it looks like they're going to, then there's a chance for China or Russia to step in and say, we can send you grain exports. And by lucky coincidence, because of all the lockdowns in China right now, a great percentage of the world's boats and ships are currently waiting outside ports in China.
Not all the computer chips, though. That's part of the problem, and that's probably going to make them much friendlier with Taiwan.
And by your assessment, because Taiwan do not want to be another Ukraine, then actually American actions are likely to accelerate.
There's a bell-shaped curve. It's a political issue in Taiwan. I haven't met with Taiwanese in quite a few years, so I don't know up to the date what there is, but I can see what the dynamic is, and you can see the international environment in which they're operating, and you can think, well, how are they going to calculate the pluses and minuses of the US versus China? What economy do we want to attach ourselves to so that we can get richer fastest?
And to stay safe and not get involved in unnecessary wars, right? I mean, when you look at the tragedy in Ukraine and all these people dying, when you've got such a strong opponent in Russia, how can you go to war with Russia for any period of time and hope to survive?
Well, that's what the world is divided into. The US and Europe, their society is built on war. Their tactic is war. It's the only foreign policy they have because they don't have economic power anymore. They've deindustrialized. The rest of the world that is trying to industrialize and trying to feed itself, China, Russia, India, the global south, they're the anti-war part of the world. So the world's divided into two parts. A rentier part supporting finance capitalism is trying to impose it on other countries to financialize all of China and Russia, to put a Margaret Thatcher or a Boris Yeltsin in charge of China if they can, to put their own candidates in charge, a General Pinochet. And you have the rest of the world trying to defend itself against this terrorism. So what the Western world that calls itself democracy is the terrorist military world. The world that it calls authoritarian is any authority strong enough to control and tax the financial interests, any economy strong enough to regulate finance and real estate and the economy is by definition authoritarian, as opposed to a democracy where Wall Street and the financial centers are the central planners. So who's going to plan society? The financial sector or the people, as in China and other countries? And the people do plan in China. It's by consensus. It's a democratic country.
I guess it's based from a Western lens. It's a different type of democracy, right?
Democracy really means, is the economy run to benefit the bulk of the population who happen to be wage earners?
Okay.
Or is it going to be for the 1%? Is the economy run on behalf of the 99%? The 99% need a strong government to run it in their own interests and cope with the counter-revolutionary neo-feudal policies of the 1%, the rentier policies.
Okay, so knowing China then, what's your take on the zero COVID policies that the Chinese authorities are implementing in some parts of the country?
So China's making a huge effort not to sicken its population with COVID. And now, of course, since the Russians have published all their findings of the US biowarfare labs in Ukraine that were designed to spread COVID-like diseases by migrating birds and bats and man-made aircraft over Russia. Now they've reopened the question, was COVID a US biowarfare from the very beginning? And the Chinese are looking at it and saying, was it engineered to work? If the Americans are trying to engineer COVID to affect mainly the Slavic population and the DNA signatures, could they have been doing the same thing against other Asians? So all of this is suddenly opened up, and until they can settle this, the World Health Organization has refused to divulge any of the US biowarfare efforts, and the US has stonewalled all efforts to find out the biowarfare. And this is like the total deal breaker that is breaking up the rest of the world and isolating American Europe. If American Europe is left with its main foreign policy, biowarfare and the atomic bombs, NATO will be shunned by the whole civilized world. And as Rosa Luxemburg said a century ago, the choice is between socialism or barbarism, and NATO, Europe and America represent the barbarism, and the alternative is socialism, which is how the world seemed to be developing in Europe and America until World War I untracked everything. And we may now finally get back on track for the rest of the world.
Michael, as always, you always get more getting into your stuff than you expected. Are there any things that you'd like to say to our listeners before we finish up?
I've probably said too much, and I hope you can expurgate anything that's really embarrassing.
I don't know about embarrassing, but I think we might get thrown off YouTube for publishing some of your comments, so we may have to go back and review a few of them. But as always, Michael, thanks so much for your time. And what we'll do, we'll send a link to everyone to your website, and also for the new book as well. Truly extraordinary levels of insight and real economics rather than theoretical or textbook stuff. So as always, from Shepheard Walwyn, thanks so much for your time and for your contribution.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to the Shepheard Walwyn podcast. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit our website www.shepheardwalwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are also on the website. And if you like the podcast, please head over to iTunes or Spotify to give us a review. It's surprisingly helpful in getting the ideas out there. So until next time, keep reading